So this week we are in a slightly different setting because the house is being renovated at the moment. And since everything in my life is kind of topsy-turvy right now and just all over the place, and I've been going through a lot of old things in my just possessions, I've been thinking a lot about transitions in life. One of the things I've been reflecting a lot about is different time periods in my life, the sort of person I used to be and what I used to read. This list is about books that really had an impact on me during different ages in my life and how they influenced me as well. I don't know if this is just me or if other people do this as well, people who are really into reading fiction. But I find that the fiction that I was reading really influenced not just the way I thought, but also decisions I made in my life. And it's actually very revealing to me as I've been, sitting down and reflecting on this, of how deeply influenced I was by what I was reading and the decisions that some of these books led me to make in my life. So I've got like this little notebook here. I don't have the physical books with me right now just because of what a mess my house is right now. I didn't really plan for it to be this way, but there are 3 classics on here and 3 more contemporary works. But I think it does say something about what I like to read. So let's get into it. The first book on this list is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And this is quite a strange one because to this day, I'm not really a huge fan of like gothic fiction. I don't really gravitate towards that. Although you could say Frankenstein is quite an outlier in whatever genre we relate it with. Some people call it the first science fiction novel. Some people call it like just a gothic masterpiece. I don't really know how to characterize it. So I read this book the summer between 7th and 8th grade. And the reason I think this book changed my life is because it shifted something in my 8th grade mind, my little 8th grade mind, because it made me engage with questions of religion and science, faith and doubt, in a way that I had never encountered before. I was raised in a religious household, but I've always had some curiosities or questions around just this idea of creation and the strange relationship between the idea of a creator and the creation. It's very famous, but it's about this sort of scientist who becomes increasingly like engrossed and maddened by his project. And his project is like he's trying to create life. And he's sort of in this almost egotistical pursuit of playing God, and Frankenstein's monster is what he creates. And that monster like really serves as a metaphor for humanity in a way, because it's monstrosity, or this entity that can't help its monstrosity and yet suffers greatly for love for his creator, that is Frankenstein, and his conflict within himself about what he is and who he is and what his purpose is and all of that. And I think this really helped me think through a lot of ideas at that age, and something about just that metaphor of Frankenstein's monster at that age really shifted something in my mind and really made me think about ideas of doubt and faith and religion and science very differently. And I think to this day I hold a lot of curiosity for those themes, and I'm still very moved by those themes somehow, Yeah, I think that's all I will say about that. So the next book that really changed the trajectory of my life in a very real way is Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. I read this book the summer after 11th grade. I think I was turning 17. I was getting to an age where you were supposed to sort of figure out what direction you're going to go in your higher studies. I wanted to do something creative. I was really into arts. I thought I might become an artist at that point in my life, but the summer I read this book, I just knew that I had to study literature. So the opening lines of this book are something along the lines of, there are no moral or immoral books. There are only books that are well written and badly written. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's the sentiment that it starts with. And this book is about this young man who gets a portrait of him painted by an artist who is infatuated with him. And basically the entire idea is that he keeps this portrait in his attic, and the portrait ages instead of Dorian himself, so all the wrinkles of age and all the kind of sins that he does, they reflect on the portrait rather than Dorian himself. It sort of plays on this theme of, morality and art and the relationship between the two. I remember reading this book with such intense fascination that summer. There used to be like this really open, very vacant park next to our house at the time, and I used to like just sneak out during the day on those summer days and just sit there alone, and I really savored this reading experience. It's the only novel that Oscar Wilde wrote, and after I finished reading The Picture of Dorian Gray, I went and read the complete works of Oscar Wilde. Like I read all his plays, all his earlier work, his poems, all of it, his letter from jail, and I just became so engrossed in both the tragedy of his life but also the aesthetic achievement and the relationship between the two. Wilde's work, and that work in particular, blended something about the arts and literary achievement together. It just blew my mind at that age. And it's the reason that I ended up studying literature. So the next book is one that I actually mentioned in my last video as well, and something tells me that I will probably continue to rave about this for a very long time. George Eliot's Middlemarch. I largely credit this book for being the reason that I got into Cambridge to study literature. There is something about this book that has just always been there with me through that particular period of my life where I was just so passionate about pursuing literature and developing myself intellectually. And for those of you who don't know, the main character in Middlemarch is a young woman who is kind of a little bit unconventional and sort of very idealistic, and her sort of life mission is to improve herself intellectually, and she makes some questionable decisions in the process. She marries like this really old man, thinking that it's going to improve her intellectually, and she just is that sort of heroine that I think any young woman who's just very intellectually curious can relate to on some level. So I remember quoting Middlemarch in my personal statement when I was applying to university to study English, and I spoke about it in my Oxbridge interview. And funnily enough, Middlemarch was the first book that was assigned to us in my first week at Cambridge, and we had to write an essay on it. And there's just something very symbolic about this book to me. I think it just symbolizes that part of my life, and also that the state of mind that I was during that time period, and just like the wonder and curiosity and just this incredible drive for intellectual pursuit that I had during that time period. And similar to Oscar Wilde, I also went and read most of George Eliot's work, not all of it. There are one or two novels that I still haven't read, but I read most of her other stuff. And when I was at university, I read her complete letters as well, which I really enjoyed. And I also think that George Eliot as a figure herself was so impactful to me, this idea of this really academic woman who was a titan of an intellect and perfected the Victorian novel, all while, masquerading under a male pseudonym. And I just love that. So the next book kind of overlaps with Middlemarch in terms of the time period that I would say it impacted me. And that is White Teeth by Zadie Smith. So this is a book that I read around the same kind of age when I read Middlemarch. And at the time, for me, it served almost as a parallel to a novel that represents all of humanity. And similar to my kind of fascination with George Eliot, I would also say that I really idolized Zadie Smith just as a figure, as like this intellectual woman. White Teeth is about like this whole cast of characters all set in London, like modern day London, and it spans like different classes and races, and just the kind of contemporary moment, the cultural moment, questions of science and faith and family and identity all sort of woven together in this really masterful way. There is a boldness and a cleverness to Zadie Smith's writing that I really was just drawn to. But I think it really was White Teeth in particular that made me want to apply to Cambridge, because Zadie Smith did a literature degree from King's College, Cambridge, and originally that's what I wanted to do as well. And I did get into Cambridge, and I did the same English degree as A.D. Smith, which still blows my mind to this day. And I think I really just looked up to both the author and the work in this case. And I think it really sparked literary ambition in me, and further fueled the seeds that had already been cemented earlier in my life to pursue that. So moving on to when I was a little bit older, I think this was when I was in my second year of university, the summer of second year. I remember during this time period, I felt quite lost, and I was often very overwhelmed because although I had achieved a lot of the goals that I had set out for myself earlier, I was among, a lot of intelligent people, a lot of academic stress. And because of the amount of literature I was consuming at that time, I was really starting to feel very burnt out. And I just randomly picked up this book. And that book was Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. Usually people cite Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day as being sort of his best work or like his masterpiece. But to me, Never Let Me Go is kind of the real masterpiece. When I started reading this book, I was going into it with a lot of frustration with my degree at the time, and just sort of, like I said, feeling very overwhelmed and burnt out. And the pace of Never Let Me Go is so like painstakingly slow. It goes at a snail's pace. It really tested my patience. And then there's a moment of release. If you haven't read it, I don't want to spoil it, but there is a moment that happens between the three main characters in this book when they're sitting in a car, and it's a very quiet moment, and yet it's so emotionally impactful because it serves as a release for all the pent up restraint of emotion that goes into, like, I would say 3/4 of this book. And when that release happens, I remember I burst into tears because it was almost like a catharsis for me as well. And I think it just reminded me why I was pursuing literature as a serious form of study in the first place, because I could see so clearly what Ishiguro had done in that book. And despite me seeing the structure of it and the foundation that he laid for that kind of climax to happen in that book, I was still so deeply moved by it. And it just reminded me of the power of words and rekindled my love and fascination for what they can do. And I think before I really got into Ishiguro's work, and particularly this book, I had always seen myself as somebody who could never really be the writer, because I always associated great writing with like this really punchy sort of wit and this greatness and loudness almost, and this all-consuming awareness of humanity, like, because those are the works that I was always drawn to and considered to be great literature. But the subtlety and quietness and intense specificity of the way Ishiguro writes, in some way it gave me some sort of permission that my quiet little voice mattered too, or that I could make it matter. And for that reason, I think I'm really grateful that I read it at that point in my life. The final book I'm going to talk about is a book that I read during the pandemic, actually, after I graduated. And at this point in my life, I was really starting to seriously try and write my own fiction. But I was struggling, and I still struggle to this day. Like, I still have a lot to work on in my own writing. But this was a book that also opened up a different kind of permission. And that is the book called Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. I read this when I was very much trying to plan a novel of my own. And I wanted to write, and still want to write, this multi-generational narrative. So Homegoing follows the lineages of two Ghanaian women, starting from colonial times to the present day. It sort of explores how those two lineages intertwine over time as well. It's just an achievement that fills me with so much awe. Just the masterful way that it has been structured. It somehow gave me a kind of permission to explore my South Asian roots, which, very different, but similarly carry a legacy of colonialism, and that is also something that has been inevitably passed down the generation. It's something that I still continue to explore and think about and try to write about, and it's a very slow process, but I think this book really was a turning point for the kind of thing I wanted to write as well, and really opened up a lot of things for me in terms of what I thought I could write. So those were 6 of the most impactful books in my life so far, and I thought it would be fun to make this and potentially look back on this video when I'm a couple of years older. If you have read any of these books or want to read any of these books, let me know your thoughts about them down below. I would really love to know what you think of any of these 6 books, because I just think it's really interesting to get different perspectives on the books that we hold so close to us. And I hope wherever you are and from wherever you're watching this, you're having a great day, and I will be back very soon.